Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my in-depth Protection Warrior class guide for Shadowlands Season 4. I've been keeping busy with Protection Warrior and Brewmaster Monk written guide stuff on Wowhead, which you should check out if you like reading more than watching videos. I will cover all the usual stuff I do in a class guide in this video, including talking about Covenants and Legendaries and gear, and everything you need to know to succeed while playing a Protection Warrior. I will also cover specific seasonal stuff about gear, since there is a lot of very different gear available to players in Season 4, now that all 3 raids can drop high item level gear, and the dungeon pool has been radically changed to eliminate all of the Shadowlands launch dungeons. I've also done the usual thing of putting in chapters so you can skip around as needed. And finally, like and subscribe, that normal YouTube stuff you're required to ask for. I think that's enough preamble. Let's talk about what's changed for Protection Warriors with Season 4. I had initially written down nothing in all caps, but then at the last minute, Blizzard made a massive, unexpected buff to Protection Warriors. I see what all the fuss is about with balanced druids complaining all the time to get buffs. I've been complaining about Protection Warrior needing buffs for a couple of years now, and this is heavenly. I feel great. I think I might become addicted to complaining. Ignore Pain now absorbs 30% more damage, and it stacks up to 30% of the warrior's maximum health instead of the previous cap of double its base value. This is a really big buff in 2 different ways. The 30% more absorb is just fantastic. It's a really big increase to warrior's ability to survive spell damage and damage over time, and really just anything that you can't block. And since warriors can basically live through anything they can block, this means that the class is probably tankier right now than it has been in my memory, and I've been playing Prot Warriors since 2005. The reality is that while Warrior was unpopular throughout all of Shadowlands leading up to Season 4, the class has actually been pretty decent in Season 3. The tier set bonuses that were introduced with patch 9.2 made the class very tanky and really gave it a lot of resources. It is a bit exhausting to play because it's so frenetic, but the tankiness is just off the charts, and it's really rewarding for all of your effort. And now it's even stronger. The increase to the cap on Ignore Pain is also very strong. The old cap was generally about 20% of a warrior's maximum health. Depending on your gear and buffs, it can fluctuate a bit, but 20% of a warrior's max health was about the same as 2 Ignore Pain casts, and that's what the cap was. Now it's a flat 30% of the warrior's maximum health. Because of the 30% base buff to Ignore Pain, that makes the cap worth about 2 1/3 casts of Ignore Pain. This is really good. The ability to bank up a decent sized shield for big boss hits is really important to being a tank that stays alive in raids. It's one of the biggest strengths that monks have going for them. It's something that blood DKs can do in a lot of situations as well. Building up decent blood shields is really important to mitigating some of the pain points on fights like Rygalon and the Jailer. And now Protection Warrior is much better at building up big shields, and it kind of fits into that collection of those 3 tanks where you can pre-mitigate a lot of predictable burst damage. That's fantastic. That's it for the base class changes. Let's go over tier sets. The 2-piece bonus grants a major rage generation and damage increase. Every time you spend 240 rage, your next Shield Slam or Thunderclap deals triple damage, generates triple rage, and casts a free Ignore Pain. Thunderclap also slows harder, but it seems to be capped around 50%. This bonus is very good. It works even if you make no rotational changes, but it gives a very powerful reward to players who are able to manage the bonus skillfully. I will also point out there's an unintended buff that occurred. Midway through Season 3, Blizzard reduced the cost of Ignore Pain from 40 rage down to 35. However, they never retuned the 2-piece bonus to compensate for that, so it still thinks that each Ignore Pain is costing you 40 rage in terms of generating stacks for it. So it actually works a little bit better than it seems like it should. The 4-piece bonus juices the 2-piece bonus even harder, adding a bunch of extra power to Avatar and generating a free 2-piece proc when you cast Avatar. Thanks to the positive rage generation feedback loop that this tier set generates in conjunction with anger management, Avatar is available roughly every 35 to 40 seconds while tanking, a normal situation. This is really good. It's very fun. I mean, it's nice to have big cooldowns up all the time. It promotes an active, aggressive playstyle over slower, more passive talents. This pair of bonuses was probably the combo that I was most excited about of all the tier sets that Blizzard made for patch 9.2, and I think it delivered. I think it really lived up to the hype. It adds a ton of extra shielding from Ignore Pain, like about a free Ignore Pain every 8 to 10 seconds. It adds a lot of damage and defensive value onto Avatar, and it can change the way you play in a fun, meaningful way, but it can also just be a really valuable bonus, even if you're, just wanting to keep playing the same way you were before you got it. It's great. You're going to want to get this 4-piece bonus as quickly as you possibly can. Now, like I said, there are 2 ways to approach this set of bonuses. The dumb warrior brain playstyle is just to play your rotation like normal. You just smash your keys, spend your rage as quickly as you can, and you're stronger now. That works pretty well, but it's not quite as good as the tactical genius version, which is where you track all of your stacks of the 2-piece bonus, called Seeing Red with a weak aura, and make sure to always spend your outburst buffs, the full 8-stack proc, on Shield Slam. That's the ideal way to play, but it will require more attention. In either case, you pretty much always want to cast Avatar on cooldown. The 4-piece turns it into a minor defensive cooldown that you can potentially line up with boss abilities, but in my experience, it's almost never worth holding. I find that the consistent mitigation of just using it and then consuming the outbursts that it gives you for free to get more Ignore Pain and more rage to reset the cooldown of Avatar is far more useful. The only time I ever do sit on Avatar is if I'm at the very end of a Mythic Plus pull and I would rather have it for the start of the next one, or if I'm at the end of a normal phase of a boss and I'm about to go into an intermission, like the Among Us phase in Lords of Dread, where there's nothing to attack. I would hate to pop an offensive cooldown and then immediately sit there and do nothing for 20 seconds. Using Outburst on Thunderclap is usually not worth doing, but I do use it sometimes at the start of pulls in Mythic Plus just to guarantee that I've established threat on everything. An Empowered Thunderclap followed by a Revenge is a great way to lock down threat, and usually the way that works out is I will charge in, hit Avatar and Thunderclap and Revenge, all right in a row, and then proceed with a normal rotation from there. During the patch 9.2 PTR, you couldn't generate more stacks of Seeing Red when Outburst was triggered and waiting to be used, so any rage that you would spend while Outburst was up was rage wasted. I don't remember if that was fixed at some point early in Season 3, or if they actually just fixed that before it even went live, but either way, that is not the case anymore. You can still generate Seeing Red stacks while Outburst is ready to go. So there's nothing wrong with, if you have an Outburst ready to go, Shield Slam is a second or two away from being off of cooldown, just simply burning through more rage and not using Thunderclap so that you can get Shield Slam back up to consume that Outburst and then immediately generate another one and try to use that one with a Shield Slam as well. If you Avatar while you have Outburst ready, or you spend enough rage to convert that Seeing Red into another Outburst, it will just overwrite the original one. You can't have multiple Outbursts banked up. You do have to use one before you generate the next. It's time to talk about Covenants. Necrolord Protection Warrior has been my dream from the moment that the Covenant Legendary was first unveiled on the PTR, and it has finally become the best choice during Season 3. This actually took a bit of convincing of people to really switch over to it. Kyrian was just such a smooth and easy playstyle by comparison, but Necrolord is so much stronger that even with the bit of extra work that's required to maintain Conqueror's Banner, it just is far superior to play Necrolord in all situations. That being said, it is harder to play than Kyrian, and it requires the full 4-piece tier set to really work effectively. Once it's set up correctly, it is the best choice. Kyrian's an easy second place choice, and if you're still gearing up and don't mind going through the work of leveling Kyrian up and then switching over to Necrolord and leveling that up as well, it can be a fine choice. I would just recommend playing Necrolord from the start, but Kyrian can be fine, and it's very good for Arms and Fury, so if you are looking to play the full range of Warrior specs, which I recommend, Warrior's very fun on all the specs, starting out as Kyrian, or at least leveling Kyrian for whatever your purposes are, is a good idea. Night Fae is clearly in third place. It basically does all the same stuff as Kyrian, it's just a lot less versatile, and it's on a longer cooldown. It deals more damage per cast, but the overall DPS and raids is lower, the consistency is lower in Mythic Plus, it's just not as good. That's really the only problem I have with it. It's not bad, and I actually like it a lot. It was what I played initially during Season 1, but it's just definitely not one of the top two options. And finally, Vinthyr Warrior is horrendous. Much like Blizzard, I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. Okay, Soulbind time. As Necrolord, Plague Deviser Merilith is the strongest Soulbind. The guaranteed mastery from using Fleshcraft is really nice. Kevin's Oozling is a really good bonus to layer over the top of Conqueror's Banner, and Ultimate Form is pretty useful on those occasions when you need to be immune to crowd control. That can potentially help you immune a stun that would stop you from being able to maintain Conqueror's Banner, which is pretty neat. If you're playing Kyrian, Mechanicos is the best Soulbind. And finally, if you're playing Night Fae, I would use Naya. She is also a terrific Soulbind. I'm ignoring Vinthyr some more. I've talked about Soulbinds, so let's go over Conduits. Regardless of which of the three Covenants you opt to play, your Covenant-specific Potency Conduit is going to be a very strong option. Adaptive Armor Fragment is pretty decent as well, it's just free strength. It's worth wearing as your number 2 Potency Conduit. After that, you have two options. As Necrolord, I prefer Ashen Juggernaut in all situations. The amount of extra rage you generate as Necrolord makes spamming Execute pretty doable on bosses that aren't dangerous in raids, and even on trash that you're trying to priority target down in Mythic Plus. Ashen Juggernaut adds a huge amount of damage in any situation where you're able to sit there and hit Execute several times in a row. If you're not playing Necrolord, or if you're being a little more cautious and defensive, Show of Force is an okay option as well. It adds a decent amount of damage in Mythic Plus. It's not huge, and it is really quite bad in single target, but the choice is yours. I would say Show of Force is better if you're playing defensively, and Ashen Juggernaut is better if you're playing more aggressively. Endurance Conduits are all pretty straightforward. Stalwart Guardian grants cooldown reduction on Shield Wall. With this conduit and anger management, and especially if you're playing Necrolord, you can consistently bring Shield Wall's cooldown under 2 minutes, which is great. Unnerving Focus is the second of the 3 decent endurance conduits for Protection Warriors. It's a little weird, but gaining extra rage generation while Last Stand is up is great. It synergizes nicely with anger management and the tier set bonuses and the Necrolord Legendary Glory. It doesn't actually increase the rage generation that you get from Conqueror's Banner or your tier set, but it still gives you more rage generation while Last Stand is up, and any amount of increased rage generation is good. It helps fuel the rage generation feedback loop. As Necrolord, I usually run 3 Potency Conduits and 2 Endurance Conduits, so I won't go into too much detail on the other 2 options, but here they are. Condensed Animosphere is a pretty decent, steady trickle of self-healing, and Brutal Vitality is also a fairly decent, steady self-healing trickle, but Brutal Vitality is reliant on being able to deal damage. Condensed Animosphere works all the time, even if you're out of melee range or you're stunned or whatever, so I like it a little bit more. Neither's really that big of a difference maker though, to be honest. Finally, Finesse Conduits. Inspiring Presence adds a small boost of defensive value onto Rallying Cry, and that's a great piece of group utility. This is a great finesse conduit. I usually go out of my way to pick it up. The other option is Safeguard. It's pretty useful as well. I see it used a lot in very high level Mythic Plus because it gives you the ability to use Intervene as a real external cooldown on other players in your group. It's not super duper strong. I think it's maybe 15%, 20% damage reduction at a high item level conduit, and it requires some effort and timing and focus to use effectively, but it can be a good targeted defensive option as opposed to Inspiring Presence, which just adds a little bit more oomph onto your rallying cry. Let's move on to Legendaries. There's two pieces I need to talk about here, and one of them is a trap. First off, you want to make all of your Legendaries with haste and versatility missives, no matter what piece or slot or whatever. Haste and versatility, those are your two best stats 100%. Okay, the legendary you want to use is Reprisal. It's the best. Number one. I like to think about it like this. Reprisal turns Charge and Intervene into separate keybinds and cooldowns for shield block. Just like you always want to keep shield block up while you're tanking, you want to use Charge and Intervene while tanking when you're wearing Reprisal. If you keep them on cooldown consistently, you'll get about 35% more shield block uptime and a little bit under 2 rage per second. That is very, very strong. By comparison, the Wall, the next one I'm about to talk about, is only worth about 1 to 1.25 rage generation per second, and it adds no shield block uptime at all. Reprisal is the absolute best legendary for Protection Warriors, zero question, and you should use it at all times. In terms of where you want to craft Reprisal, I would recommend it on boots. Okay, the Wall's the trap legendary I was referencing before. It's extremely simple, it grants you 5 extra rage for each shield slam. That doesn't get scaled up by the tier set bonuses, and that's about it. This is much weaker than Reprisal. It got used for a while because Reprisal was a little overwhelming for some players, but I actually think that learning to play Protection Warrior the right way is a much better and more rewarding approach than using the Wall and only getting a small portion of what the class has to offer. I think if you're using Reprisal and you start to put all the pieces together, you're gonna feel like you're playing a much stronger class than you will if you're playing the Wall and getting maybe a bit more of an understanding of a very stripped down version of the class. Now, as for where to craft your Unity, that's kind of up to you. You can generally use Unity just to fill any slot in your gear where it's a little weak, and rings are a decent option because you have 2 of them, so there's less friction on your gear there. Because Season 4 isn't increasing the item level of Legendaries beyond 291, the ideal spots for Legendary would be Belt and Bracers. They're lower item level, and you're eventually going to be able to get regular gear that would be higher item level than your Legendaries, which is a little weird, but it just means that you want your Legendaries to be in slots where they're relatively lower item level, loses you the least amount of overall stat budget. And that would be Bracers or Belt. Rings are also okay though too. So just to recap here, Haste and Verse are your preferred stats, you run Reprisal on boots, and you want to put Unity wherever it fixes up your worst piece, but ideally on Belt or Bracers. I'm going to go over talents now. Prot Warrior has 2 primary talent setups, one for Mythic Plus and one for Raids. Some of these talents gain a lot of value from tier set bonuses, so let me just break everything down. The first 2 tiers are totally locked in. I wouldn't change them for anything. I wouldn't change them under threat of death. Devastator is always the best talent in its row. Double Time has incredible synergy with Reprisal. Let's move on. Booming Voice is the best talent in Raids, and if you have tier set bonuses, it is the best choice in Mythic Plus as well. Best Served Cold is still pretty popular in Mythic Plus because it provides a lot of consistent cleave damage, and that's great, especially for holding threat. Or just maximizing your damage output. I mean, those are very related. I prefer Booming Voice because it helps with maintaining Conqueror's Banner, and provides both offensive and defensive value. If you don't have your tier set bonuses, or if for whatever reason you're not playing Necrolord, I would definitely run Best Served Cold. I think that rage generation is really only worth it in Mythic Plus, I mean. if you're playing Necrolord. In raids, I would always run Booming Voice, even if I didn't have 4-piece, even if I was playing Kyrian, still better than Best Served Cold in like single target or 2-target in raid situations. Crackling Thunder and Booming Stride are both good talents. I prefer Crackling Thunder in Mythic Plus because it helps make sure you always hit every enemy in each pull with Thunderclap. That really helps with maintaining threat at the start of pulls. Booming Stride is a good option in raid fights with mobility requirements. Heroic Leap is a really good mobility skill, like one of the absolute best in the game, and cutting its cooldown from 45 seconds down to 30 and adding a short move speed boost onto it is really awesome for spots where you have to move around a lot, like the Jailer. For situations where you don't have to move around much, like Lords of Dread or most of the time in Mythic Plus, I think that just having the extra reach on Crackling Thunder to be able to hit mobs, maybe you're a couple of yards out of melee range, especially in Mythic Plus at the start of pulls, Crackling Thunder way better there. Indomitable is the only talent worth using in its row. The other options aren't even close. Ravager is the best option in Mythic Plus because it's a good burst damage and rage cooldown that is fantastic for establishing threat at the start of pulls or just layering with other offensive cooldowns like Booming Voiced, Demo Shout, and Avatar, and Strength Potion, or Trinket Procs, or whatever. Into the Fray is better in raids because it provides consistent haste value, and quite a bit of it. 10%'s quite a lot. That's much better over the course of a long fight than Ravager, but in the more bursty environment of Mythic Plus, where you have slow periods in pulls, especially at the end as mobs start to die, and then periods of downtime in between pulls, that ability to start out with this huge burst of power and rage generation is really useful. Raids are, more drawn out and kind of longer, and so that consistency is more valuable there. And in the final tier, once you have tier bonuses, Anger Management is a 100% must-have talent no matter what. Until that point, Heavy Repercussions can be a useful defensive option for maximizing your damage reduction in Mythic Plus. It's slower and it's not as fun to me, but in some of the pre-Season 3, or even during Season 3 when I didn't have tier set bonuses or double legendary, and I was still playing around with Kyrian, running Heavy Repercussions was, pretty satisfying and felt very tanky in Mythic Plus. Anger Management is good even without the tier set, but it's not mandatory like it is with the tier set. Heavy Repercussions is, pretty good for feeling tanky against autos. You can pretty much get 100% uptime on shield block with it, which is very, very good. The Protection Warrior rotation is fairly simple. Playing a Protection Warrior is, I was gonna say super easy, that's not right. Playing a Protection Warrior is intense. It isn't actually as complicated as something like Death Knight, where you have one rotation if Dancing Rune Weapon is up, and then a different one to manage when it's down. You pretty much have the same rotation all the time, and there's not really that many keybinds in it, but you do have a lot of off GCD abilities that are core parts of your rotation. Because of that, you want to be ready to shield block, ignore pain, charge, intervene, heroic leap, all as rotational skills in between your normal abilities that are on the GCD. Because of that, it can get pretty intense on your keyboard hand and potentially your mouse hand, depending on how you have things keybound. The only other real rotational note I have to mention here is that Execute deals less damage per rage than Revenge once you get to 4 or more targets. So if you're fighting 1 to 3 targets, dump rage with Execute when you can. If you're fighting 4 or more, Execute can actually still be useful if you're trying to take down a key target, like in Tazavesh Gambit, the annoying little murlocs that set down Invigorating Fish Stick. Those are good guys to execute. Even if you have a dozen guys around ready to revenge, you probably are better off just killing those guys off before they can heal the rest of the pack back to full. I might have done Tazavesh earlier tonight. That being said, Execute is generally not as good for DPS in AoE compared to Revenge, even when it's available. Defensively, Protection Warrior has about the same playstyle as it has throughout all of Shadowlands, just with a lot more rage now to spend on Ignore Pain, Revenge, and Execute. Remember always to use shield block as much as you can while actively tanking. Also remember that as long as you're using Reprisal, you need to treat Charge and Intervene like separate shield block cooldowns as well. So be sure to Heroic Leap and charge back in, or Intervene out and charge back in as much as you can. Always try to keep shield block up to prevent as much damage as possible. I realize I've said that multiple times, it's because it's really important. I'm going to say it again before I finish. Ignore Pain is good for preventing unblockable damage or covering yourself up during the periods where shield block is down. It's also just really good as a rage dump. You're going to be full or close to full on rage a lot, and you never want to go over the cap on rage ever. There's never a point where you want to hit 100 rage and keep generating rage. Totally worthless and pointless. So, for that purpose, you want to be hitting Ignore Pain whenever you get pretty high up on rage. And finally, just remember to keep shield block up as much as you can while actively tanking. I was going to do a section about defensive cooldowns, but Warrior actually doesn't feel like a cooldown-oriented tank anymore compared to Blood DK or Vengeance Demon Hunter. So I guess use Spell Reflection to reflect spells. That's really good advice. I feel very smart for having said that. Shield Wall's a pretty short cooldown thanks to anger management, so you should be pretty aggressive with it. Demo Shout is kind of more like an offensive cooldown if you're using Booming Voice, but you can hold it if you really need a specific defensive layer, even if you're running Booming Voice and you're trying to generate as much rage as you can and pump out as many Ignore Pains and Revenges and so on. Honestly, Warrior's ability to survive is mostly about managing your rage and your shield block. If you're getting slammed, a good defensive trinket or a shield wall will probably save your life. Last Stand is pretty weak now, but it can be okay sometimes, and Rallying Cry in raids is usually used as a raid cooldown, but in Mythic Plus, it can be, again, used as a party cooldown, but if you're absolutely desperate and you don't have anything left, it's an okay personal defensive lifeline as well. I've been doing a how to pull section on all the tanks because I think that's something a lot of players find pretty useful. So here's how I do it on Warrior. First, I charge into the pack of mobs. If I have offensive cooldowns available, like Avatar, I try to use them while I'm mid-charge. Then I spend my first GCD in melee range on Thunderclap, and my second on Revenge. That's pretty much it. So I'll give a little more detail on the pull, because this is a guide, but I really think that Warrior's the best tank in the game at pulls because it's just about as simple as charge, Thunderclap, Revenge for establishing threat at the start of a pull. Maybe Demon Hunter's a little easier, you just jump in an Immolation, Aura, and Sigil. But Warrior doesn't need a big long cooldown to hold threats, so Warrior probably wins. Anyways, I like using Thunderclap first on pulls because I know it's going to hit everything in a pretty large radius around me, whereas Revenge as the first spell could miss if something runs around to the side, or Charge does what it sometimes likes to do and makes you like run at a weird 90-degree angle or make a triangle while trying to get the mob. Once I'm in melee range and I have threat on everything, I try to use Demoralizing Shout and Ravager pretty quickly. At the same time, I am getting Shield Block and Ignore Pain up, and then I roll into the normal rotation, hitting Shield Slam, using Ignore Pain to dump Rage, intervening out and charging back in, and so on. But yeah, pulling on a Warrior, pretty good. The basic stat priority for Protection Warrior is about the same as it has been for most of this expansion. I haven't mentioned it previously, but Strength is the most important stat for Protection Warrior. It's about 2 times as valuable per point as Haste or Crit or anything for DPS. It's also about twice as valuable for defensive purposes because you get 80% of your Strength converted directly into armor, just a permanent uptime buff. And it also affects your Ignore Pain value, and you get a multiplier for your Strength out of Conqueror's Banner as Necrolord. Strength is very good. There's very few options, spots where you can choose to take Strength or something else. Trinkets are pretty much the only spot where that's the case, but what that means is, wear Strength trinkets. Pretty much always. Always wear Strength trinkets. Now let's move on to secondary stats. Haste is very good. You want as much as you can get. Versatility, also very good and very consistent. It's probably a little bit weaker than haste just because all of the abilities that really matter on warrior are cooldowns, and haste is giving all of those cooldown reduction either directly, shield slam, thunderclap, shield block, that sort of thing, or indirectly by giving you more rage generation, anger management, then, fueling the cooldown reduction of Avatar, which obviously gets better the more haste you have. Versatility, though, it gives you a lot of extra defensive value just all the time, which is pretty nice. Mastery and crit are both okay, but they're less consistent. Crit's a little bit better offensively, but the least consistent defensively. Mastery is more defensively consistent, but not that great because it doesn't work on unblockable damage at all, and its offensive contribution is pretty poor. Technically, it has a small impact on unblockable damage because it gives you more attack power, which fuels your ignore pains, but it's pretty weak. It's certainly a lot weaker than versatility on that end, or haste, obviously. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are tier set bonuses and your double legendary, of course, then item level, and then sockets and haste and versatility, and the rest of your stats don't really matter that much. You want haste enchants on your rings and haste gems in all of your sockets. Celestial Guidance is the best weapon enchant for all content. Strength to gloves, avoidance to cloak, stats to chest, and I think that covers it for enchants. Now before we finish up, let's go over some of the gear that's going to be available in Season 4 that's a little special and talk about how to spend your dinars. Dinars are a currency that you acquire by killing bosses in raids, and you use them to purchase items from 3 vendors who are standing over to the right side of the Great Vault. They'll sell you up to 3 items in total, and then they disappear for the rest of the expansion, for the rest of all civilization. They sell weapons and trinkets from the 3 raids, and that's it. So basically you want to buy the best weapon and trinkets you can, and, loot other gear, I suppose. The items you buy are normal item level, which is 278 or 285, depending on which bosses it drops from in the raid. But with another currency you acquire by killing raid bosses, you can upgrade them to heroic and then mythic, eventually going all the way up to potentially 311 item level, which is insane. As far as I understand, this is the way it'll work with gear that drops normally in normal and heroic raids, but that's kind of been hard to test on the PTR. I guess I'll know in a couple of days. So let's run through the most important pieces of gear you want to pick up from this system. And we'll start with the number 1, Old Warrior's Soul from Sylvanas. This is absolutely the best trinket in the game in all situations for all 3 of the strength tanks. It grants almost twice as much haste as any other trinket once it stacks up. It takes 100 seconds to stack up to full and will last for 15 seconds once you're out of combat, so you can use it in Mythic Plus. You will need to chain pull like crazy, but that's how Warrior plays anyway, so you're fine. It's an amazing trinket. You're probably going to wear this all the way until you hit max level in Dragonflight. Next up is Devastated World Shard, the weapon from Rygalon. This is actually not the best weapon in the game for a protection warrior. The weapon from Denathrius is Haste Verse, so it's slightly better, but because it requires a token that you get from Denathrius dying, and then exchange with a vendor in your Covenant Hall, you can't buy that weapon from the vendors in Oribos. You have to actually kill Mythic Fated Denathrius on your Brat Warrior, which is, kind of a tall order. The difference in stat budgets between these 2 weapons is pretty minor, and I would recommend just buying a Devastated World Shard unless you manage to get lucky and get a Denathrius weapon to drop. I guess technically you could kill him on normal and then upgrade it to heroic and then upgrade that to mythic. Yeah, do that. Ruined Crest of Lordaeron from Lords of Dread is the best shield in the game for warriors, so your options are either to farm one or to buy one. Much like the weapons situation, it's up to you, but you really should try to get this shield one way or the other. And since shields are a really big defensive item for warriors, this is a great option to just buy with dinars. If you manage to get lucky with drops for any of these 3 items I just covered, there are 3 other decent trinket options that you can purchase with dinars instead. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, Reactive Defense Matrix, and Elegy of the Eternals. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis is the best defensive trinket in the game. It drops from the 9 in Sanctum of Domination. That's an early boss and generally regarded as one of the easier bosses in the expansion, so just killing them and looting the shard is a pretty good option. I mean, it obviously has some RNG, you do have to get it to drop, but it's just not that difficult to get one normally. The drop rate isn't super high, but in my experience, it's way better than the drop rates for Old Warrior Soul or Reactive Defense Matrix or Devastated World Shard and Ruined Crest of Lordaeron. This is a really powerful defensive bonus. It reduces a flat amount of damage from all hits and all dot effects while it's active. That calculation is done after all damage reduction effects are calculated, so for Protection Warrior it's very close to being total damage immunity while it's active. I'm a little surprised it never got nerfed, but I guess they like how strong it is. I mean, technically speaking, it's 8 seconds of insane tankiness on a 90-second cooldown, so I guess you could argue it's not even 10% uptime, but given the way that most of the raid boss fights have been designed in this expansion, it just sort of deletes a boss mechanic or two on each of the really difficult fights. I think that on a Protection Warrior, you can run 2 haste trinkets as a standard setup for easy content, but anytime that I have come up against something difficult like the last couple of bosses in basically each raid, or even just doing regular Fortified Mythic Plus weeks, I tend to like swapping to Shard of Enhilda's Aegis. I would also add that this trinket is strong enough that I would recommend doing LFR to try and get it when Sanctum of Domination is the fated raid of the week. Even at 265 item level, I think this trinket is insanely strong, probably better than almost any other trinket you can get anywhere in the game, even at higher item levels. It's just such a good idea to have this trinket available if you really need another big defensive cooldown. Next up is Reactive Defense Matrix. This is a really, really good combo of both shielding and damage output, and it performs really well while tanking when you have really high uptime. Bosses like Sludge Fist, Rygalon, and Fortified Mythic Plus are all the kind of places where it shines. Where I think this trinket has some problems would be fights like the Jailer, where you get slammed really hard for a little while, and then you spend potentially like 40 seconds not tanking the boss at all. That's not as good. Elegy of the Eternals gives a moderate chunk of haste. At 278 item level, that's 121 haste, and then it grants 10% of that, so 12 haste, to all of your party members. It's a pretty good trinket, probably the weakest of this collection of 3, but it's still good for all-around value, and it doesn't require you to be tanking all the time to maximize its value like Reactive Defense Matrix, nor does it require you to be just getting orbitally striked by enormous bursts of boss damage like Shard of Enhilda's Aegis. Stone Legion Heraldry is one little extra one I'm throwing in here. It's a Strength Verse trinket from Stone Legion Generals in Castle Nathria. It's pretty basic. I would not go out of my way to buy it, and I wouldn't necessarily fight to take it away from somebody else who wants it more like most of the other tanks except Blood DK. But if you get your hands on one, it's pretty good, and it'll definitely work while you're trying to get yourself a nice haste trinket. Finally, let me point out Weave of Warped Fates. It's a good normal cheat death trinket. It has strength, which is nice. It doesn't really do anything except prevent deaths, and the 8-minute cooldown is pretty long. It is an option if you really need more defensive value and you just don't have other trinkets available. I don't think it's worth buying unless you get crazy lucky with drops and you already have most of the other really good trinkets on this list and you just want to buy one as a safety net. In general, I think cheat death is usually somewhat of a crutch. It can be useful for preventing raid wiping deaths when damage is high and unpredictable, so I like them for progression rating, but I tend to think of them more as passive cooldowns. This one's an 8-minute cooldown, and that just seems worse to me than 90-second cooldowns like Shard of Enhilda's Aegis, or even just the more consistent stat budget that you get out of Elegy of the Eternals or Stone Legion Heraldry, or the consistent damage reduction and shielding and reflection, for that matter, of Reactive Defense Matrix. Elegy of the Eternals and Old Warrior Soul is a pretty standard trinket setup that I think you can run most of the time. If you find that you need a big defensive cooldown and Shield Wall's not cutting it, swapping Elegy out for Shard of Anhilda's Aegis to give yourself another major defensive cooldown is really useful. This is especially true for effects that deal damage over time, like Rygalon's Corrupted Strikes or Sylvanas' Banshee's Bane in Phase 3. If you need steady defensive value, Reactive Defense Matrix is a really good option. Any combination of these 4 trinkets will work, but I would always try to have Old Warrior's Soul equipped once you have it. Now let's move over to the gear that comes from Mythic Plus dungeons in Season 4, and remember, all the Shadowlands dungeons other than Tazavesh are going away. So Blood-Spattered Scale is no longer going to be a part of your life. It's also getting a pretty big nerf too, so it's dead. Delete it. Don't do that week 1. Codex of the First Technique from Tazavesh is a very, very overrated trinket that was nerfed late into Season 3. I will admit I got bamboozled by this thing because I bought into the hype. It's a passive proc that provides 10% damage reflection, which sounds good, and it was good initially prior to the nerf on monks because it would work with stagger. But this isn't about monk. It works after all other damage mitigation effects, including Ignore Pain. Because Protection Warrior has such high base mitigation already, and you pretty much have Ignore Pain absorbing part of almost every hit you take while tanking, this really doesn't do much. There's a large part of the community who see this trinket getting used by Blood DKs and Vengeance Demon Hunters at high Mythic Plus levels where it is pretty good for them, and then not knowing about that interaction with Ignore Pain, think that it'll be good for the rest of the classes. That's just not the case, so don't wear this. It's bad. It's also a stamina trinket, and you don't want to wear that. You want to wear a strength trinket. Solia's Secret Technique from Tazavesh Gambit is another great haste trinket option. It requires someone else in your party to also be running haste as their primary, number 1 secondary stat, but that's fairly common. It's not a huge inconvenience, but it is enough to make me not really want to use it if I have Old Warrior Soul and Elegy of the Eternals available. If I don't, and I'm just trying to go farm a haste trinket on my warrior, and I don't have either of those two, or I only have one of them, this is a great one to go after. Ticking Sack of Terror is a damage trinket from Tazavesh that has a pretty decent proc, but unfortunately it's a mastery trinket rather than just giving you primary stat. Because of that, you're generally going to get more value out of a standard trinket, like Solia's Secret Technique that gives you strength rather than this. It's okay if it's all you have, but I wouldn't go out of my way to get it. Mechagon gear is fairly simple. I would say the main pieces of valuable gear in Mechagon are the rings. Ideally, you want a logic loop of recursion and an overclocking bit band. They both have haste, and when combined, they give you a big fat haste proc on top of that base haste. Very good. The only other really notable pieces of gear from Mechagon are Fusion Hacker, a weapon with no stats that has a really nice damage proc on it, a really terrible shield that I don't remember the name of and don't want to waste time putting on the screen here. It's bad. And Remote Guidance Device, which is a pretty basic damage trinket. You press the button, like a flaming ball or wheel comes flying out of nowhere and does a bunch of single target and a little bit of AoE damage. Karazhan doesn't have a huge amount of great gear either. The Choker of Barbed Rains from Atumen can provide a decent damage proc, but the stats on it aren't very good. The Amulet of the Last Guardian is haste verse, so that's ideal in terms of stats. It forms a set with the Wine-Stained Mantle, but that cloak is crit mastery, so it's really not worth wearing that set at all. Eye of Command is a pretty simple trinket. It grants a lot of crit, so it's only for DPS, but it is okay for DPS. Toe Knee's Promise is a haste trinket with an on-use damage effect. It's okay. Again, I would prefer a strength trinket whenever possible. There is a little interaction with this trinket where if you use it in conjunction with another trinket that drops from that same boss, it's a crit trinket that does like lightning damage or something. If you use the two of them in conjunction with each other, one of them will wind up doing more. The problem is that you can't use both of them at the same time. They have like a short window where they have to overlap, and obviously if you're using two on-use trinkets, they have a 20-second cooldown. So this is something you have to coordinate with somebody else in order to use a trinket that doesn't have strength on it. I'm going to go ahead and say pass. The Ring of Collapsing Futures is very good. It just adds a free damage on use effect, but that's great, at least until you can put together a Mechagon ring set. Now let's move on to the Warlords of Draenor dungeons, and in terms of the drops from Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot, their loot tables are enormous, but mostly filled with tons of nearly identical rings and gloves and, I don't know, bracers and boots. They have almost all of the possible stat configurations, but I think there are a few things that aren't available, like there's a couple of pieces that maybe don't have haste verse, which would be what you're going after. The more important thing to note is that they have a lot of rings and necks available in those two dungeons, and unfortunately, because those rings and necks have strength or agility or intellect on them, the secondary stats on them are severely underweighted. So much so that they aren't as good as a normal piece of jewelry without strength that's of the same item level. That doesn't mean you can't wear them if they are your highest item level piece in that slot, but it does mean that those WAD pieces of jewelry won't be as good as jewelry that just has stamina and secondary stats and is around the same item level. Now, stat budget will obviously matter a little bit. You know, if it's a 278 mastery crit ring or a 278 strength haste verse ring, I'd probably wear the haste verse one over the no strength mastery crit ring. But if it's haste verse in both cases, I'd definitely be wearing the one with stamina and more haste and more verse. And no strength, obviously both rings are going to have stamina. And that's it on trinkets and important Season 4 gear. If I didn't include a piece of gear, that's probably because it's not very good. It can still work while you try to get your hands on some of the items on this list, but it shouldn't be a more permanent solution. As we're moving into Season 4 of Shadowlands, Protection Warriors are absolutely in the best spot they've been all expansion. Necrolord is really powerful, it has a ton of rage and a really active playstyle that can handle pretty much everything. That's great. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Protection Warriors in Shadowlands Season 4, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands and Dragonflight content, and thank you for watching. Bye.